The autumn wind cut through Cedar Creek Valley like a blade, carrying with it the scent of desperation and dying dreams. What happened on that cold October morning in 1923 would become the talk of Montana for decades to come. A struggling cowboy named Jake Sullivan was about to make a decision that would shock an entire valley and change 9 lives forever. But first, let me ask you something that'll make this story even more powerful. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding Cedar Creek Valley like a shroud, and Jake Sullivan knew it was going to be one of those days that carved itself into a man's memory, whether he wanted it there or not. He'd ridden into town not for any noble purpose, but because his last 3 steers had wandered off again, probably looking for grass that wasn't brown and brittle. His ranch was hemorrhaging money faster than a punctured water barrel, and every day brought him closer to joining the growing line of failed dreamers, heading east with their tails between their legs. Jake's boots hit the wooden planks of Main Street with the hollow sound of a man carrying too much weight on his shoulders. At 35, he looked older. The Montana sun, and 2 years of grief having etched lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible choices. His wife Sarah had died in the influenza outbreak of 1921, taking with her not just his heart, but his reason for fighting to keep the Sullivan Ranch alive. Now it was just him. 3 loyal ranch hands who deserved better wages than he could pay, and a herd of cattle that seemed determined to find new ways to cost him money. The town square buzzed with an energy that felt wrong, like the excitement people get from watching a house burn down. Jake had seen crowds like this before, during the war, when they'd gather to hear casualty reports, faces hungry for tragedy that wasn't their own. Today, that hunger had drawn them to a makeshift platform constructed from shipping crates and scrap lumber, the kind of hastily built stage that spoke of desperation and legal necessity. Walter Grimsby stood atop that platform like a vulture, surveying carrion, his expensive suit a sharp contrast to the rough wood beneath his polished shoes. Grimsby owned half the businesses in 3 counties and had a reputation for collecting debts the way other men collected stamps, methodically, ruthlessly, and with genuine pleasure. His voice carried across the square with the practiced authority of a man who'd grown rich from other people's misfortune. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grimsby announced, consulting a gold pocket watch with theatrical precision, "we are gathered here today to settle the outstanding debts of the O'Brien estate. By order of the county court, all assets and dependencies of the deceased Thomas O'Brien will be sold to satisfy creditors." Jake felt his stomach tighten. He'd known Tom O'Brien in passing, a quiet Irish farmer who'd tried to make a go of it on 15 acres of stubborn land 15 miles outside town. Word was that Tom had worked himself to death trying to pay off medical bills after his youngest boy was born sickly. What Jake hadn't known, what made his blood run cold as he looked at the platform, was that Tom O'Brien's dependencies included 9 human beings. They stood in a line to Grimsby's left, and Jake had to blink twice to make sure he wasn't seeing. Things. Margaret O'Brien, whom everyone called Maggie, stood with her chin raised despite the circumstances, her weathered hands resting protectively on the shoulders of her youngest children. She was a handsome woman in her early 40s, the kind who'd probably been beautiful before life wore her down to essentials. Her dress was clean but patched, her hair pinned back with the severe efficiency of someone who'd learned to waste. Nothing, not even time on vanity. Behind her, her children arranged themselves by instinct rather than instruction. Patrick, the eldest at 16, had his father's broad shoulders and his mother's defiant eyes. He stood like a man already, jaw set, hands clenched, ready to fight a world that seemed determined to break his family apart. 14-year-old Katie had positioned herself between her mother and the smaller children, her face pale but determined, already shouldering responsibilities no child should have to carry. The middle children, Timothy at 12, Sean at 10, and 8-year-old Bridget, clustered together with the survival instinct of prairie dogs sensing a hawk overhead. 6-year-old Mickey still believed the world was fundamentally good, his wide eyes taking in the crowd with more curiosity than fear. 4-year-old Mary clutched a corn-husk doll to her chest, while baby Daniel, barely walking, swayed on unsteady legs, blissfully unaware that his entire future was about to be decided by strangers with money. The O'Brien family unit, Grimsby, continued with the detached tone of a man discussing livestock, represents a debt of $847, including medical expenses, property taxes, and accrued interest. The widow O'Brien and her 8 minor children will be contracted for a period of 7 years to satisfy this obligation. Jake felt sick. He'd heard of debt bondage, of course. It was legal, if barely, and not uncommon in rural areas where cash was scarce and desperation plentiful. Families could be bound out to work off debts. Children apprenticed to masters who might or might not treat them better than slaves. But seeing it happen, watching 9 human beings offered up like merchandise, made his chest tight with a rage he hadn't felt since Sarah's funeral. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. These were decent people, mostly farmers and shopkeepers who went to church on Sundays and believed in doing right by their neighbors. But times were hard, and there was something seductive about watching someone else's tragedy unfold, especially when you could tell yourself there was nothing you could do about it anyway. A few men in expensive coats, cattle barons and land, speculators from Billings, examined the family with calculating eyes, clearly seeing opportunity in the O'Briens' misfortune. "We'll start the bidding at $600 for the family unit," Grimsby announced. "Individual family members may be bid upon separately at the discretion of interested parties." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. They were talking about splitting up the family, separating children from their mother, siblings from each other. He watched as Maggie O'Brien's composure finally cracked, just for a moment, her hand flying to cover her mouth as she realized what those words meant. Little Mary pressed closer to her mother's skirts, and baby Daniel began to fuss, sensing the tension, even if he couldn't understand it. "600!" called out Harrison Blackwood, a rancher from the eastern part of the valley known for working. His hired hands harder than his horses. "But I only want the woman and the older boys. Got no use for babies and girls." A murmur ran through the crowd, some shocked, others nodding with the grim practicality of people who'd learned to think of survival in purely economic terms. Maggie O'Brien's face went white, and Patrick stepped forward protectively, his young face twisted with helpless fury. "650!" shouted another voice. "I'll take the girls for my household staff. The boys can find their own way." Jake's hands clenched into fists. He thought of Sarah, of how she'd always said that a person's true character was revealed not in how they treated their equals, but in how they treated those who couldn't fight back. He thought of his own empty house, his failing ranch, his dwindling bank account. He thought of the sensible thing to do, which was to turn around and walk away from a situation that was none of his business and would only bring him trouble. Instead, he found himself stepping forward. $1,000, Jake called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. "For the entire family, together." Every head turned toward him. Grimsby blinked in surprise, then smiled, with the satisfaction of a man who'd just seen his profits increase. Blackwood scowled and opened his mouth to bid higher, but Jake cut him off. $1,000, Jake repeated, pulling out his worn leather wallet and counting bills with deliberate slowness. "Cash, right now, but only if they stay together." The crowd buzzed with confusion and speculation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Most people knew Jake Sullivan by reputation. A decent man who'd been dealt a hard hand, but hardly wealthy enough to throw around that kind of money. What they didn't know was that the money in his wallet represented the last of his savings. The emergency fund he'd been hoarding against the day when his ranch finally failed completely. Grimsby's eyes glittered with greed. "Mr. Sullivan, I believe. Are you prepared to honor that bid immediately?" Jake stepped up to the platform, ignoring the stares and whispers. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in Maggie O'Brien's face, the way her children pressed against her like chicks seeking shelter from a storm. Baby Daniel had started crying, a thin, hungry sound that cut through the autumn air like a rebuke to every person standing there watching. "I am," Jake said simply, counting out the bills onto Grimsby's outstretched palm. "On one condition." Grimsby paused, his expression wary. "What condition?" Jake turned to face Maggie O'Brien directly. Her green eyes met his brown ones, and he saw in them a mixture of hope, fear, and something that might have been recognition, one desperate person acknowledging another. "Mrs. O'Brien," Jake said, his voice gentle but carrying clearly across the square, "I'm offering you and your children a place at my ranch. Work, if you're willing, food and shelter regardless. But I want to be clear about something. This isn't bondage. You'll be free to leave whenever you choose, all of you, together." The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the wind rattling the dry leaves on the cottonwood trees. Grimsby's face cycled through confusion, anger, and calculation before settling on barely concealed fury. "Now see here, Sullivan," Grimsby sputtered. "The terms of the debt contract clearly state—" "The terms," Jake interrupted, his voice hardening, "state that the debt will be satisfied by labor. Doesn't say anything about the conditions of that labor, and it sure as hell doesn't say anything about splitting up families." He turned back to Maggie O'Brien, who was staring at him with the expression of someone who'd stopped believing in miracles long ago and was struggling to process what appeared to be one happening right in front of her. "Ma'am," Jake continued, "I won't lie to you. My ranch is struggling. I can't promise luxury or even comfort, but I can promise you'll be treated with dignity. Your children will be safe, and nobody will ever sell any of you again." Maggie O'Brien's composure finally shattered completely. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. Patrick stepped forward and offered Jake his hand, a man's handshake, firm and grateful. The younger children clustered around their mother, still not entirely sure what had happened, but sensing that the immediate danger had passed. Jake paid Grimsby the money and signed the papers, ignoring the man's muttered complaints about irregularities and unprecedented conditions. The crowd began to disperse, some disappointed that the spectacle was over, others visibly relieved that they wouldn't have to watch a family destroyed. A few people approached Jake as he helped the O'Briens gather their meager possessions. Canvas bag of clothes, a family Bible, a few cooking pots, and the cornhusk doll that little Mary refused to let go of. Doc Emma Harrison, the town's physician, and one of the few women who commanded universal respect, pressed a small bag of medical supplies into Jake's hands. "For the baby," she said quietly. "He's been sickly since birth. Nothing serious, but he'll need watching." Father Murphy, the Irish priest who'd buried Tom O'Brien just 3 weeks earlier, clasped Jake's shoulder. "What you've done today," the priest said in his soft brogue, "it's the kind of thing that makes a man right with God and his own conscience." Even Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man not given to displays of emotion, nodded approvingly as he helped little Mary climb into Jake's wagon. "You've done something good here, Sullivan. Don't let anyone tell you different." The ride back to the Sullivan Ranch passed in relative silence. The O'Brien children, exhausted by the trauma of the morning, dozed against each other in the wagon bed, while Maggie sat on the bench beside Jake, baby Daniel sleeping in her arms. The autumn landscape rolled past them, golden grasslands broken by stands of aspen already turned brilliant yellow, distant mountains purple with shadow and snow. "Why?" Maggie asked suddenly, her voice barely audible over the creak of wagon, wheels and the steady clip-clop of Jake's horses. Jake considered the question for a long moment. Why had he thrown away his financial security for 9 strangers? Why had he taken on the responsibility of feeding and housing nearly twice as many people as his failing ranch could realistically support? Why had he traded his own uncertain future for the even more uncertain future of a family he'd never spoken to before today? "My wife Sarah," he said finally. "She used to say that we're all just walking each other home, said the only difference between the lucky and the unlucky is timing and circumstance." He glanced at Maggie, seeing his own grief reflected in her tired eyes, figured today it was my turn to do some walking. As the Sullivan Ranch came into view, a modest collection of weathered buildings set against the backdrop of pine-covered hills, Jake found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. The main house was solid but small, built for a childless couple, not a family of 10. The barn needed repairs, the fences were falling down, and winter was coming fast. He had enough food stored to last until spring, but that had been calculated for 4 people, not 10. But when little Mary woke up and asked in her small, clear voice, "Is this home now?" Jake found he couldn't regret his decision, no matter how impractical it might prove to be. "Yes," he told her, lifting her down from the wagon with gentle hands. "This is home now." The first challenge came before they'd even unloaded the wagon. Carlos Mendoza, Jake's foreman, emerged from the barn with Ben Cooper and Tommy Wright flanking him. All 3 men wore expressions of barely concealed alarm. Carlos, in particular, looked like a man watching his boss lose his mind in real time. "Jake," Carlos said carefully, his slight accent adding weight to his words, "we need to talk." But before Jake could respond, 6-year-old Mickey O'Brien had spotted the horses in the corral and was climbing the fence rails with the fearless determination of a child who'd grown up around farm animals. Sean, not to be outdone by his younger brother, scrambled up beside him, and within moments both boys were petting the noses of Jake's 2 riding horses, their earlier trauma temporarily forgotten in the simple joy of meeting new animals. "They're beautiful," breathed Katie O'Brien, her teenage reserve cracking at the sight of a particularly elegant mare. "What are their names?" "That's Thunder," Jake said, pointing to the gelding Mickey was petting, "and the mare is called Sunrise." "Hoodie!" He found himself smiling despite the worried looks from his ranch hands. "They're gentle as lambs with children, but they've got spirit when they need it." Tommy Wright, the youngest of Jake's employees, stepped forward with characteristic directness. "Boss, where exactly are we going to put all these folks?" "The bunkhouse is full up with us 3, and the main house." "We'll figure it out," Jake said, though he was asking himself the same question. The main house had 3 bedrooms. The master bedroom, where he slept alone now, a smaller room that had been intended as a nursery, but had remained empty, and a tiny space that Sarah had used for sewing. It was barely adequate for a family of 4, let alone 10. Maggie O'Brien seemed to read his thoughts. "Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly, "we're used to making do with little. If you have a barn or even a lean-to, we can—" "No," Jake interrupted more firmly than he'd intended. "You're not sleeping in barns. We'll work something out that's proper." Ben Cooper, the oldest of the ranch hands and the closest thing Jake had to a father figure, stepped forward with the practical wisdom that had kept the Sullivan Ranch running even when Jake's heart wasn't in it. "The old bunkhouse," Ben suggested thoughtfully. "The one that's been serving as a storage shed. It's bigger than the one we're using now. If we clean it out, put in some walls and proper beds, it could house the boys. The girls and the little ones could take the spare rooms in the main house." It was a good solution, and Jake felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. The old bunkhouse had been built by his father back when the ranch employed twice as many men. It was sturdy and weather-tight, just cluttered with years of accumulated equipment and supplies. That could work, Jake agreed. Carlos, think you and the boys could help me clear that out this afternoon? Carlos nodded, though his expression remained troubled. Sí, jefe, but we still need to talk about other things. Jake knew what other things meant. Food, wages, the coming winter, the simple mathematics of survival that had already been strained to the breaking point before he'd added 9 more mouths to feed. But those were problems for later. Right now, his new family needed immediate shelter and reassurance. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. While the men worked to clear and partition the old bunkhouse, Maggie O'Brien and her daughters explored the main house with the careful attention of people trying to understand their new environment without presuming too much. Jake found himself watching them from the corner of his eye, noting how Katie automatically took charge of baby Daniel when her mother needed both hands free, how Bridget quietly helped little Mary arrange her few possessions in the tiny sewing room, how Maggie herself moved through the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of a woman who'd learned to make meals from whatever was available. By evening, they'd managed to create something resembling living arrangements. Patrick and Timothy would share one half of the divided bunkhouse, with Sean and Mickey in the other half, close enough for comfort, but separate enough for the older boys to have some privacy. Katie and Bridget took the former nursery, while little Mary and baby Daniel stayed with their mother in the sewing room, which Jake had hastily fitted with a borrowed crib and a narrow bed. The sleeping arrangements were crowded and far from ideal, but they were temporary solutions, and everyone seemed to understand that. What mattered was that they were together, safe, and no longer at the mercy of Walter Grimsby's auction block. Dinner that first night was a revelation. Maggie O'Brien took charge of the kitchen with quiet authority, transforming Jake's usual bachelor fare of beans and hardtack into something approaching a feast. She found vegetables he'd forgotten he had, seasoned everything with herbs she'd somehow packed in her small bag of possessions, and served it all with a grace that reminded Jake painfully of his own mother's dinner table from years past. The conversation was stilted at first, everyone still feeling their way around the strange new dynamic. But children, Jake reflected, had a way of breaking through adult awkwardness. Mickey regaled the table with his theories about why horses liked sugar cubes. Sean demonstrated his ability to balance a spoon on his nose, and even shy Timothy emerged from his shell long enough to ask intelligent questions about cattle ranching. "Do you really have 100 cows?" Timothy asked, his 12-year-old voice cracking with excitement. 87 last count, Jake replied, though the number might be lower now if those 3 strays had wandered into the mountains. But it's not as exciting as it sounds. Mostly it's fixing fences, hauling water, and trying to keep them from getting into trouble. "I could help," Patrick offered immediately. "I'm good with animals, and I'm not afraid of work." Jake studied the 16-year-old's eager face and saw something of himself at that age, desperate to prove himself, to be useful, to matter. "I'm sure you could," Jake agreed. "We'll start you off slow, see what you take to." It was a small moment, but Jake saw how Patrick's shoulders straightened at being taken seriously, how the boy's eyes lit up with something that had been missing. Earlier, hope for a future that extended beyond mere survival. After dinner, as the family settled into their new routine, Jake found himself sitting on his front porch in the gathering darkness, trying to process what he'd done and what it might mean. The night air carried the scent of wood smoke from the chimney and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. From inside the house came the gentle murmur of voices, Maggie reading to the younger children from the family Bible, Katie helping Bridget with some mending, the comfortable domestic sounds of a family at peace. Carlos joined him on the porch, settling onto the steps with the careful movements of a man whose bones had been jarred by too many years in the saddle. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, two men who'd worked together long enough to communicate without words. "You want to tell me what you're thinking?" Jake asked finally. Carlos was quiet for another moment, choosing his words carefully. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that you've got a good heart, Jefe. But I'm also thinking that a good heart doesn't put food on the table or keep the bank from foreclosing." It was a fair concern, and Jake had been wrestling with the same calculations. His ranch was already operating on borrowed time and borrowed money. The cattle market was unpredictable, winter feed was expensive, and he'd just committed to supporting 6 more people than his budget could realistically handle. "How bad is it?" Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. Carlos pulled out a worn ledger book, squinting at the figures in the dim light from the house windows. "Without the O'Briens, we might have made it through winter if the cattle prices held steady and we didn't lose any more stock. With them," he shrugged eloquently. "Spring?" Jake asked. "Maybe. If everything goes perfect. If nothing breaks, nobody gets sick, and we find buyers for every head of cattle at top dollar." Carlos closed the ledger with a soft thud. "You know how often everything goes perfect on a ranch." Jake knew. In 15 years of ranching, he could count on one hand the number of times everything had gone according to plan. There were always problems: disease, weather, equipment failures, market fluctuations, accidents. The margin for error in ranching was thin under the best of circumstances, and these were far from the best of circumstances. But as he sat there contemplating potential financial ruin, Jake heard little Mary's laughter from inside the house, followed by Maggie's gentle voice, telling her to settle down for sleep. He thought about the look in Patrick's eyes when he'd been offered real work, about the way Katie had instinctively protected her baby brother, about the simple human dignity of a family sleeping safely under a roof instead of being scattered to the winds by economic necessity. "We'll make it work," Jake said finally, though he wasn't entirely sure how. Carlos nodded, unsurprised by his boss's stubbornness. "Sigh, we'll make it work, but we're going to need some luck." As if summoned by the word luck, Ben Cooper emerged from the bunkhouse with Tommy right behind him. Both men looked like they had something to say, but weren't sure how to say it. "What's on your minds?" Jake asked. Ben cleared his throat. "Well, boss, Tommy and I were talking, and we wanted you to know that we're with you on this, whatever comes." "That's right," Tommy added earnestly. "What you did today, taking in those folks, it was the right thing. My ma always said that doing right by others is the only way to live with yourself." Jake felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with financial worries. He'd been lucky in his employees. Carlos, Ben, and Tommy weren't just hired hands. They were men of character who'd stuck with him through Sarah's death and the ranch's decline when they could have easily found work elsewhere. "I appreciate that," Jake said simply. "All of you. I know this isn't what you signed on for." "Neither was watching a family get torn apart," Ben replied with characteristic bluntness. "Sometimes what's right is more important than what's smart." From inside the house came the sound of baby Daniel crying briefly before being soothed by his mother's voice. The night was settling deep now, with stars beginning to appear in the clear Montana sky. In a few hours, dawn would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new questions about how to make an impossible situation work. But for tonight, 9 people who'd started the day facing separation and bondage were sleeping safely under Jake Sullivan's roof. And 3 men who'd learned to measure their worth by their loyalty rather than their wages were committed to helping make it work. It wasn't much of a foundation for a sustainable future, but it was something. And sometimes, Jake reflected as he rose to go inside, something was enough to build on. The first real test of their new arrangement would come with the dawn. when theory would meet the practical reality of feeding 10 people, finding useful work for willing hands, and figuring out how to turn a struggling ranch into a home for an unexpected family. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Jake Sullivan's house was full of life, and that felt like victory enough. Dawn came early to the Sullivan Ranch, announced by the insistent crowing of an ancient rooster that had survived more Montana winters than anyone cared to count. Jake had been awake for an hour already, lying in his empty bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house full of people. Footsteps creaked overhead as someone made their way to the kitchen. Water splashed in the wash basin, and he could hear the soft murmur of voices planning the day ahead. When he finally emerged from his bedroom, Jake found Maggie O'Brien already at his stove, her hair pinned back and an apron that must have belonged to Sarah tied around her waist. The sight stopped him cold for a moment, not because Maggie reminded him of his wife, but because she didn't. This was a different woman making herself at home in his kitchen, and somehow that felt like both a betrayal and a relief. Coffee was already brewing, filling the air with rich aroma that seemed to promise better things ahead. Maggie looked up from the pan where she was frying eggs and offered him a tentative smile. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing toward the stove. "The children wake early, and I thought." "It's fine," Jake assured her, accepting the mug of coffee she offered with hands that were grateful for the warmth. "More than fine. I haven't had a proper breakfast in longer than I care to admit." Through the kitchen window, he could see Patrick and Timothy already outside, feeding hay to the horses under Carlos's watchful supervision. The boys moved with the easy confidence of children who'd grown up around livestock, and Jake felt a spark of optimism. Extra hands, even young ones, could make a real difference on a ranch if they were willing to learn. Katie appeared in the kitchen doorway, baby Daniel balanced on her hip, while little Mary clung to her free hand. The 14-year-old already looked tired, though the day had barely begun, and Jake was reminded that Katie had probably been shouldering adult responsibilities long before yesterday's auction. "Ma," Katie said softly, "Daniel's diaper needs changing and I can't find where." "You packed the extra cloths." Maggie's face flushed slightly. We didn't have any extras to pack." An awkward silence fell over the kitchen. Jake realized with a growing sense of the magnitude of what he'd taken on that the O'Brien family had arrived with, literally, nothing beyond the clothes on their backs and a few treasured possessions. They had no winter coats, no extra blankets, no supplies of any kind. What had seemed like a simple act of human decency was revealing itself to be a complex logistical challenge. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, echoing his words from the night before. "Doc Harrison mentioned the baby might need special care anyway. I'll ride into town this morning, get what's needed." Bridget and Sean burst through the kitchen door with the explosive energy of children who'd discovered new territory to explore. Both were talking at once about the barn cats they'd found, the creek that ran behind the house, and the chicken coop that Mickey was convinced contained a rooster big enough to ride. "Can we gather eggs?" Sean asked breathlessly. "Patrick said we could help with chores if we asked proper." Maggie looked to Jake for permission, and he nodded. "Long as you're careful and don't spook the hens. Carlos can show you how it's done." The morning routine that emerged felt both chaotic and natural. The O'Brien children folded themselves into the rhythm of ranch life with an adaptability that spoke to their resilience, while Jake's hired hands adjusted their usual patterns. To accommodate eager helpers and curious questions, Timothy proved to have a natural way with horses, while Sean showed unexpected patience in learning to milk the 2 dairy cows. Even little Mary found a role, carefully collecting eggs in a basket nearly as big as she was. But it was Patrick who truly impressed Jake. The 16-year-old worked with a determination that bordered on fierce, throwing himself into every task as if his life depended on proving his worth. When Carlos mentioned that the fence along the north pasture needed mending, Patrick volunteered immediately, shouldering a load of fence posts that should have been too heavy for someone his size. "Slow down, son," Ben Cooper advised gently, watching Patrick attack the fence repair with barely controlled intensity. "This ain't a race, and you don't need to prove anything to anybody." Patrick paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Yes, sir, I do," he said quietly. "Mr. Sullivan took us in when nobody else would. Least I can do is earn my keep." It was Tommy Wright who provided the solution to Patrick's driving need to contribute. The young cowhand had been watching the boy work and recognized something of his own younger self in Patrick's desperate eagerness to belong. "You know," Tommy said thoughtfully, "we've been talking about breaking that young stallion out in the far corral. Been putting it off because it's dangerous work, needs someone with good reflexes and no fear. You interested in learning?" Patrick's eyes lit up with an excitement that transformed his entire face. "You'd teach me? Really?" "If your ma doesn't object," Tommy replied. "Horsebreaking is skilled work. Man who can gentle a wild horse without breaking its spirit, that's someone who'll always have employment." When they approached Maggie with the proposal, her initial reaction was predictable maternal concern. But when she saw the hope in Patrick's eyes, the way he stood straighter at the prospect of learning a trade that could give him independence and respect, she nodded slowly. "You'll be careful?" she asked Tommy. "He's all I have of his father. I'll watch him like he was my own brother," Tommy promised solemnly. "Won't let him try anything he's not ready for." Jake found himself moved by the exchange. It was more than just teaching a skill. It was the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, the kind of mentorship that could change a young man's entire trajectory. Patrick would learn not just how to break horses, but how to read animals, how to be patient with living things, how to build trust instead of demanding obedience. Meanwhile, the practical challenges of housing and feeding the O'Brien family were becoming more apparent by the hour. The sleeping arrangements that had seemed adequate for one night revealed their inadequacy when faced with the prospect of weeks or months of cohabitation. The single bathroom in the house created bottlenecks that grew more problematic as everyone tried to get ready for the day. The kitchen, designed for a couple, felt cramped with Maggie, Katie, and various children, all trying to help with meal preparation. Most pressing was the simple matter of clothing. The O'Brien children had been wearing the same outfits for 2 days now, and with winter approaching, they would need warm coats, boots, and multiple changes of clothes. The family's single set of sheets and blankets was woefully inadequate for the approaching cold, and baby Daniel's needs alone required supplies that Jake hadn't thought to consider. "I'll need to make a substantial trip to town," Jake told Carlos as they reviewed the morning's work. "Clothing, blankets, baby supplies, extra food stores. It's going to be expensive." Carlos nodded grimly. "How much do we have in the emergency fund?" Jake had been avoiding that calculation, but he forced himself to face it now. $300, maybe $350 if I can get good prices for those steers we've been meaning to sell." "And how much will all this cost?" Jake did rough mental arithmetic, factoring in winter clothing for 7 children and 2 adults, bedding, baby supplies, and increased food stores. "More than we have." The weight of his impulsive decision was settling on Jake's shoulders like a physical burden. He'd acted from the heart yesterday, driven by moral outrage and genuine compassion, but now the practical consequences were demanding attention. He'd committed to caring for 9 additional people with resources that had already been stretched thin, supporting 4. But as he watched little Mary carefully carrying a basket of eggs twice her size, her small face serious with concentration, Jake found he couldn't regret his choice. These weren't numbers on a ledger. They were human beings who deserved better than what life had dealt them. "We'll manage," he said, echoing his words from the night before. People have survived worse with less. The trip to Cedar Creek turned out to be more complicated than Jake had anticipated. Word of yesterday's events had spread through the small community with the speed of wildfire, and Jake found himself the subject of intense scrutiny from townspeople, who weren't sure whether to consider him a saint or a fool. At Porter's General Store, Sam Porter himself emerged from behind the counter to help Jake with his lengthy list of purchases. Sam was a practical man who'd built his business on understanding his customers' needs and financial limitations, and his expression grew increasingly concerned as Jake's pile of merchandise grew higher. "Jake," Sam said quietly, glancing around, to make sure they weren't overheard, "this is a lot of goods. You sure you can cover it?" Jake had been dreading this question. "I can cover what's essential. The rest, well, maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement." Sam studied Jake's face for a moment, then glanced at the list again. Winter coats for 7 children, warm boots, flannel pajamas, diapers and baby clothes, additional bedding, increased grocery staples. It represented nearly $500 worth of merchandise. "Tell you what," Sam said finally, "I'll extend you credit for half of this. Pay me when you can, and we'll call it even. But Jake," he paused, his expression serious, "you need to think hard about what you're taking on. Good intentions don't put food on the table." It was the second time in 12 hours that someone had questioned the wisdom of Jake's decision, and he was beginning to wonder if they were right. But then he thought about Maggie O'Brien's face when she realized her family wouldn't be separated, about Patrick's eager determination to contribute, about little Mary asking if this was home now. "I appreciate the credit," Jake said, simply, "and I'll pay you back with interest." The loading of supplies into Jake's wagon attracted attention from other townspeople, most of whom seemed to feel compelled to offer their opinions on his recent actions. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house made a point of mentioning how some people took on more than they could handle and ended up hurting everyone involved. Reverend Walsh, on the other hand, stopped to shake Jake's hand and quote scripture about welcoming strangers. But it was his encounter with Walter Grimsby that proved most unsettling. The businessman emerged from the bank just as Jake was securing the last of his purchases, and his expression suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. "Sullivan," Grimsby said, his voice carrying the cold satisfaction of a man who believed he was about to be proven right. "I trust you're finding your new arrangement to be everything you expected?" Jake straightened slowly, his hands still on the wagon ropes. "I'm finding it to be exactly what I expected, a family that needed help." Grimsby smiled, but there was no warmth in it. How noble. "And when you can't pay your mortgage next month because you've overextended yourself playing savior, what happens to your precious family then?" The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Grimsby held the mortgage on Jake's ranch, and if Jake defaulted on payments, the banker would have every legal right to foreclose. The O'Brien family, freed from one form of bondage, could easily find themselves back on an auction block if their rescuer couldn't maintain his own financial stability. "I'll make my payments," Jake said quietly, though he wasn't entirely sure how. "For their sake," Grimsby replied. "I hope you're right. It would be unfortunate if your charitable impulses resulted in even greater hardship for those poor children." The ride back to the ranch gave Jake plenty of time to contemplate Grimsby's words and their implications. The banker was right about the financial reality. Jake was walking a tightrope now, with very little margin for error. A bad winter, a disease outbreak among the cattle, a drop in beef prices, any number of common ranching catastrophes could destroy not just his own livelihood, but the security of 9 people who were depending on him. But when Jake arrived home, to find Patrick successfully gentling the young stallion under Tommy's patient guidance, when he saw Maggie hanging laundry on a line that hadn't been used since Sarah's death, when little Mickey ran to greet him with a gap-toothed grin and a report on the day's adventures, Jake felt his resolve strengthen. Yes, he was taking a tremendous risk. Yes, the practical challenges were daunting, but he was also witnessing something remarkable. The transformation of his empty house into a home, the emergence of hope in children who'd learned not to expect it, the quiet strength of a woman rebuilding her life from nothing. That evening, as the expanded household gathered for dinner, Jake announced his plans for expanding the living quarters. The old bunkhouse arrangement was temporary at best, and with winter approaching, they needed better solutions. "I'm thinking we add rooms to the main house," Jake explained, sketching rough plans on the back of an envelope. "Extend the north wall, put in proper bedrooms for the boys, maybe a larger kitchen and a second bathroom." Patrick looked up from his plate with excitement. "I could help build it. I'm good with tools and I learn fast." It'll be expensive," Katie pointed out with the practical wisdom of someone who'd learned to count every penny. Lumber, nails, glass for windows. Jake had been thinking the same thing. The construction would cost money he didn't have. But the alternative, cramming 10 people into a house designed for 4, wasn't sustainable either. "We'll do as much of the work ourselves as we can," Jake said. "Keep the costs down by providing our own labor." Ben Cooper, who'd built half the structures on the ranch, nodded approvingly. "Foundation work is tricky, but the rest is just patience and measuring twice before you cut once." Boy like Patrick could learn a lot working on something like that. It was Carlos who asked the question everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. "And if we can't afford to finish it before winter?" Jake met his foreman's worried gaze steadily. "Then we'll make do with what we have until we can. People have survived worse conditions." Maggie, who'd been listening quietly while helping, baby Daniel with his dinner, finally spoke up. "Mr. Sullivan, you've already done more for us than we had any right to expect. If money's tight, money's always tight on a ranch," Jake interrupted gently. "The question isn't whether we can afford to do this, it's whether we can afford not to." After dinner, as the children settled into their evening routines and the adults lingered over coffee, Jake found himself alone on the porch with Maggie. The autumn air was crisp enough to hint at the coming winter, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "You're worried," Maggie observed, settling into the chair beside his. "About money, about whether you've bitten off more than you can chew." Jake didn't deny it. "I keep thinking about what happens if I fail. What happens to your family if I lose the ranch trying to support too many people?" Maggie was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet strength of someone who'd faced loss before and survived it. "My husband Tom used to say that the only real failure was not trying when you had the chance to help. He said a man could lose everything he owned and still sleep peacefully if he knew he'd done right by others." "Easy to say when you're not responsible for 9 lives," Jake replied, though without bitterness. "Maybe," Maggie acknowledged, "but I've been responsible for 8 lives for the past 3 weeks, ever since Tom died. I know what it feels like to lie awake at night wondering how you're going to feed everyone tomorrow, how you're going to keep them safe and warm and hopeful when everything seems to be falling apart." She turned to look at him directly, her green eyes steady in the lamplight from the house windows. "What you did yesterday," she continued, "taking us in when you had every reason to walk away, that wasn't the action of a man who fails at what matters. That was the action of a man who understands that some things are more important than money or security or playing it safe." Jake felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I just don't want to let you down, any of you." "Then don't," Maggie said simply, "but don't let fear of failure stop you from trying either. My children have hope again because of what you did. Whatever happens next, that's worth something." From inside the house came the sound of Patrick reading aloud to his younger siblings, his 16-year-old voice stumbling occasionally over difficult words, but pressing on with determination. Through the window, Jake could see Katie braiding little Mary's hair while Bridget played quietly with her corn-husk doll. Baby Daniel slept peacefully in a makeshift crib that Ben had cobbled together from spare lumber. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that Jake hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, and he realized that somewhere in his worrying about money and mortgages and practical challenges, he'd lost sight of what he'd actually accomplished. Yesterday, these children had faced separation and bondage. Tonight they were safe, together, and planning for a future that extended beyond mere survival. "You're right," Jake said finally. "Whatever challenges come, we'll face them together." Maggie smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, Jake saw genuine happiness in her expression instead of just determination and hope. "Together," she agreed. "That makes all the difference." As if summoned by their conversation, Carlos emerged from the bunkhouse and approached the porch. His expression was serious, but not troubled, the look of a man who'd been thinking hard about practical problems and had reached some conclusions. "Jake," Carlos said, settling onto the porch steps, "I've been running numbers, thinking about ways to make this work financially." Jake braced himself for more bad news, but Carlos surprised him. "The way I see it," Carlos continued, "we've got more hands now than we've had in years. Good hands, willing hands. Patrick's already shown. He can work, and Timothy's not far behind. Even the younger boys can help with lighter chores. More hands means we can take on projects we've been putting off, breaking horses for sale, clearing that bottom land for spring planting, maybe even taking on some contract work for neighboring ranches." It was an interesting perspective, and Jake found himself considering the possibilities. "You think there's enough work around to make a difference?" "I know there is," Carlos replied with confidence. "Jake Morrison's been looking for someone to break a dozen horses he bought wild from the reservation. The Hendricks need help clearing timber from their north section. Even old Mrs. Patterson's been asking around for someone to build her a new chicken coop." Jake felt a stirring of something that might have been optimism. He'd been so focused on the additional expenses of supporting the O'Brien family that he hadn't fully considered the additional income potential of having more workers. "It's worth exploring," he agreed, "but we'd need to be careful not to take on more than we can handle while still maintaining our own operation." "That's where having good people makes the difference," Carlos said, glancing toward the house where Patrick was still reading to his siblings. "That boy's got the makings of a real horseman. Give him a year or two of proper training, and he could be earning top wages anywhere in the territory." Maggie had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. "Patrick would like that. He's always been good with animals, and he needs something to be proud of, something that's his." As if sensing that he was being discussed, Patrick appeared in the doorway. Baby Daniel balanced awkwardly in his arms. The 16-year-old looked exhausted, but satisfied, the kind of tired that came from a day of meaningful work. "Ma," Patrick said, "Daniel's fussing, and Katie's already asleep. I think he might be hungry again." Maggie rose immediately, taking the baby from her eldest son's arms. "Thank you, sweetheart. You should get some rest yourself. Tomorrow's another long day." Patrick nodded, but he lingered for a moment, looking out at the darkened ranch buildings with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. "Mr. Sullivan," Patrick said quietly, "I wanted to thank you again for what you did yesterday, for all of us. I know it wasn't easy, and I know it's going to be harder still, but you gave us something we hadn't had in a long time." "What's that?" Jake asked. Patrick considered the question seriously before answering. "A chance to be more than just people things happen to. A chance to be part of building something instead of just surviving whatever came next." After Patrick went inside and Maggie followed to tend to the baby, Jake and Carlos sat in comfortable silence for a while. The night was fully dark now, with a canopy of stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear mountain air. From the bunkhouse came the soft murmur of voices as Ben and Tommy settled in for the night, while from the main house came the gentle sounds of a family preparing for sleep. "You think this can work?" Jake asked finally. Carlos was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think," he said slowly, "that we've got something here worth fighting for. Whether it works or not, well, that's up to us." It wasn't the guarantee Jake might have hoped for, but it was honest, and it was enough. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new tests of their resolve and resourcefulness. But tonight, 9 people who'd started the week facing an uncertain and frightening future were sleeping safely under his roof, and that felt like success of the most important kind. Jake rose from his chair, suddenly feeling the weight of the long day and the longer one ahead. "Get some rest, Carlos. We've got a lot of work to do if we're going to make this dream into reality." "Sí, Jefe," Carlos agreed, standing and stretching. "But you know what? I'm starting to think we might just pull it off." As Jake made his way inside, he paused in the kitchen to check on the coffee pot and bank the fire in the stove. The house felt different now. Lived in, purposeful, full of the quiet energy that came from people building a life together. It was a feeling he'd almost forgotten existed, and he was grateful to rediscover it. The challenges ahead were real and daunting. Money would be tight, winter was coming, and 10 people living in close quarters would test everyone's patience and adaptability. But they had something valuable to build on: willing hands, determined hearts, and the kind of hope that came from knowing they were all committed to making it work. Tomorrow would test that commitment in new ways, but tonight it was enough to know that it existed. October brought the first hard frost to Cedar Creek Valley, painting the grass silver and warning everyone that winter was approaching faster than anyone wanted to admit. The mornings began with ice crystals on the water troughs and breath visible in white puffs as the expanded household of the Sullivan Ranch went about their daily routines. What had started as an emergency arrangement was slowly transforming into something more permanent, more intentional, and more complicated than anyone had originally anticipated. The construction of additional rooms had begun in earnest, despite the financial strain it represented. Jake had managed to secure lumber on credit from the sawmill in Billings, promising payment after the spring cattle sales, and the sound of hammering and sawing now competed with the usual ranch noises of lowing cattle and nickering horses. Patrick had thrown himself into the construction work with an intensity that worried Maggie, rising before dawn to help Ben Cooper with the foundation work and staying until well past dark to finish whatever task had been assigned to him. "That boy's going to work himself into an early grave," Maggie confided to Jake one evening as they watched Patrick and Timothy struggling to position a heavy beam despite their obvious exhaustion. "He acts like he's got to prove he deserves every bite of food, every night under our roof." Jake understood the sentiment because he felt it himself. The weight of responsibility for 9 additional lives pressed on him constantly, manifesting in restless nights and a hypervigilance about every aspect of ranch operations. He found himself checking and double-checking calculations, worrying about weather patterns, and lying awake mentally rehearsing contingency plans for various disasters that might befall them. But the children were adapting to ranch life with remarkable resilience. Sean had appointed himself chief egg collector and took his duties seriously, carefully recording each day's production in a notebook Katie had given him. Little Mary had befriended the barn cats and spent hours in serious conversation with them about matters only she understood. Mickey had discovered that horses were even better listeners than cats. and could often be found perched on fence rails, regaling thunder and sunrise with elaborate stories about dragons and buried treasure. Timothy, at 12, occupied an awkward middle ground between childhood and the adult responsibilities that Patrick seemed determined to shoulder. He was too young for the heavy construction work, but too old to be satisfied with collecting eggs and feeding chickens. It was Carlos who found the perfect role for the boy, teaching him to read the subtle signs that indicated when cattle were sick, injured, or in distress. "Animals can't tell you what's wrong," Carlos explained as he and Timothy rode out to check on the herd one crisp morning. "But they'll show you if you know how to look. That cow there, see how she's standing apart from the others? How her head's hanging lower than normal? That's telling us something." Timothy proved to have an intuitive grasp of animal behavior that impressed even the experienced ranch hands. Within a week, he was spotting problems that might have gone unnoticed for days, potentially saving the ranch hundreds of dollars in veterinary bills and lost livestock. Katie had found her niche in the expanded household by taking charge of the younger children's education. With no school within reasonable distance, she'd appointed herself their teacher, using the few books the family had managed to save and whatever materials Jake could provide. Her makeshift classroom in the main house's front parlor buzzed with activity each morning as she worked with Mary on basic letters and numbers while helping Bridget with more advanced reading. "She's got a real gift for teaching," Doc Emma Harrison observed during one of her visits to check on baby Daniel's progress. "Have you thought about what happens when winter keeps everyone inside for weeks at a time? These children are going to need more structured education if they're going to have any future beyond ranch work." It was another concern to add to Jake's growing list. He'd been so focused on immediate survival needs that he hadn't fully considered the long-term implications of his decision. The O'Brien children deserved the same educational opportunities as any other children, but providing those opportunities in an isolated ranch setting would require resources and planning that stretched beyond his current capabilities. The financial pressures were becoming more acute as autumn progressed. The additional food costs alone were straining Jake's budget, and the construction expenses were consuming what little reserve he'd managed to accumulate. When Carlos presented him with the monthly accounts, the numbers painted a stark picture of their situation. "We're spending about 40% more than we're bringing in," Carlos reported, his expression grim. "The construction costs, the extra food, clothing for the children, medical supplies for the baby, it's adding up faster than we anticipated." Jake studied the figures, trying to find some mathematical sleight of hand that might make them less daunting. "What about the contract work? Any word from Morrison about those horses he needs broken?" "He's interested, but he wants to see our work first. Wants Patrick to break one of his horses as a demonstration before he commits to the full contract." It was a reasonable request, but it put additional pressure on Patrick's shoulders. The 16-year-old had progressed remarkably under Tommy's tutelage, showing a natural feel for horse psychology that couldn't be taught. But breaking horses for money was different from learning the skill for personal satisfaction. A single mistake could result in injury to horse or rider, and either outcome would damage their reputation before it was even established. "What does Tommy think?" Jake asked. "Is Patrick ready for that kind of responsibility?" Carlos nodded slowly. "Tommy says the boy's got instincts you can't teach, but he's also got something to prove, and that can make a man take unnecessary risks." The demonstration was scheduled for the following Saturday, and the entire ranch felt the tension as the date approached. Patrick spent every spare moment working with different horses, refining his technique and building confidence. Tommy shadowed him constantly, offering advice and catching mistakes before they became dangerous habits. "Remember," Tommy counseled as they worked with a particularly skittish mare, "it's not about dominating the horse. It's about convincing her that working with you is better than fighting you. You've got to be firm but fair, confident but not arrogant. Patrick absorbed every word, his concentration so intense that he seemed unaware of anything beyond the horse and the task at hand. Watching him work, Jake was struck by the transformation that had occurred in just a few weeks. The desperate, frightened boy who'd stood on Walter Grimsby's auction platform had become a focused young man with a skill that could provide him with independence and self-respect. But the demonstration would test more than Patrick's horsemanship abilities. Word had spread through the valley about the ambitious plans taking shape at the Sullivan Ranch, and Jake Morrison's property would likely host more than just a business transaction. Neighboring ranchers, townspeople, and various curiosity seekers would all be watching to see whether Jake Sullivan's grand gesture was sustainable or simply an expensive act of charity that would ultimately fail. The night before the demonstration, Jake found Patrick sitting alone on the porch, staring out at the darkened corral where the test horse waited. The young man's shoulders were rigid with tension, and his hands clenched and unclenched repeatedly as he mentally rehearsed the next day's work. "Can't sleep?" Jake asked, settling into the chair beside him. Patrick shook his head without taking his eyes off the corral. "I keep thinking about what happens if I fail tomorrow. What happens if I can't break Morrison's horse, or if I get hurt trying? You've invested so much in us, given us so much. What if I let everyone down?" Jake understood the feeling intimately. The weight of other people's expectations could be crushing, especially when those people were depending on you for their very survival. But he also recognized that Patrick's anxiety was driven by something deeper than fear of failure. It was driven by love for his family and gratitude for the chance to contribute meaningfully to their security. "You know what I learned when I first started ranching?" Jake said finally. "I learned that the fear of failing is almost always worse than actual failure. Failure teaches you something. Fear just paralyzes you." Patrick finally turned to look at him, his young face serious in the lamplight from the house windows. "But what if I'm not good enough? What if I'm just fooling myself about having any talent with horses?" "Then you'll find something else you're good at," Jake replied simply. "But Patrick, I've watched you work. Tommy's watched you work. Carlos has watched you work. We've all seen something special in how you handle horses. Tomorrow isn't about proving whether you have talent. It's about showing other people what we already know." The conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Maggie in the doorway, baby Daniel fussing in her arms. She looked tired in a way that went beyond simple physical exhaustion, and Jake realized that the stress of their situation was weighing on her as heavily as it was on him. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to interrupt. Daniel's been restless all evening, and I thought some fresh air might help." Patrick immediately rose to help his mother, taking the baby with the practiced ease of an older brother who'd been helping care for siblings most of his life. Daniel settled immediately in Patrick's arms, his fussing subsiding into contented gurgling. "He knows his big brother," Maggie observed with a tired smile. "You've always had a calming effect on children and animals alike." As they sat together in the cool night air, Jake was struck by the picture they presented, a makeshift family bound together by circumstance and choice, facing an uncertain future with nothing but determination and hope. It wasn't the life any of them had planned, but it was the life they were building together. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind that promised an early winter. By 9 o'clock, a small crowd had gathered at Jake Morrison's ranch to witness Patrick's demonstration. Morrison himself was there, of course, along with his foreman and several of his regular hands. But they'd been joined by neighbors and townspeople who'd come out of curiosity about the young horsebreaker they'd been hearing about. Walter Grimsby was among the spectators, his presence adding an uncomfortable tension to the already charged atmosphere. The banker's expression suggested he was hoping to witness a failure that would vindicate his skepticism about Jake's ability to support the O'Brien family. Sheriff Bradley was also present, though his reason seemed more supportive than judgmental. The horse Morrison had selected for the demonstration was a 3-year-old gelding with intelligent eyes and a stubborn streak that had frustrated 2 previous attempts at breaking. He was neither the easiest nor the most difficult horse Patrick could have drawn, but he would provide a fair test of the young man's developing skills. Patrick entered the corral with calm deliberation, his movements smooth and confident despite the audience watching his every move. He spent several minutes simply being present with the horse, allowing the animal to become accustomed to his scent and energy before making any attempt at contact. "He's taking his time," Morrison observed approvingly. "Too many young cowboys want to rush the process, prove how tough they are. This boy understands that patience is part of the skill." Tommy Wright stood at the corral fence, ready to intervene, if necessary, but confident enough in his student's abilities to let Patrick work independently. Carlos and Ben flanked him, their expressions tense but hopeful. Jake found himself holding his breath as Patrick made his first contact with the horse, reaching out slowly to touch the animal's neck. The gelding shied away initially, but Patrick didn't pursue him. Instead, he stood perfectly still, allowing the horse to circle back and investigate him on its own terms. When the animal finally approached close enough for Patrick to stroke its neck again, the young man's face broke into a genuine smile of accomplishment. "Good," Tommy muttered under his breath. "Trust first. Everything else follows." The process continued for nearly an hour, Patrick gradually gaining the horse's confidence through patience and consistency. He managed to slip a halter over the animal's head without resistance, then spent additional time accustoming the horse to being led around the corral. Each step was deliberate and methodical, building on the previous success without rushing toward the ultimate goal. When Patrick finally placed a saddle blanket on the horse's back, the animal trembled but didn't bolt. The saddle itself followed without incident, though Patrick took his time cinching the girth, constantly talking to the horse in soothing tones that seemed to calm both the animal and the watching crowd. The moment of truth came when Patrick prepared to mount for the first time. This was where most horses decided whether they would accept a rider or fight to dislodge the unwelcome burden. Patrick approached the moment with the same deliberate calm he'd maintained throughout the session, placing his foot in the stirrup and pausing to ensure the horse remained relaxed. When he finally swung into the saddle, the gelding stood perfectly, still for several heartbeats, as if considering its options. Then, with a resignation that suggested acceptance rather than defeat, the horse began to walk forward at Patrick's gentle urging. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, and Jake felt a surge of pride so intense it surprised him. Patrick had not just succeeded in breaking the horse, he'd done it with a skill and finesse that impressed even experienced horsemen. The young man's face was radiant with accomplishment as he guided the now docile gelding around the corral. At various gates, Morrison was clearly pleased with the demonstration. "That's exactly the kind of work I'm looking for," he told Jake as they watched Patrick cool down the horse. "Gentle but effective, taking the time to do it right instead of just getting it done. I'd like to contract with you for 12 horses, payment on completion of each animal." It was exactly the kind of opportunity Jake had been hoping for, but he forced himself to negotiate carefully. The work would provide much-needed income, but it would also require a significant time commitment from Patrick and potentially expose the young man to additional risks. "What's the timeline?" Jake asked. "And what's your standard rate for this kind of work?" The terms Morrison offered were fair and would provide enough income to significantly ease the ranch's financial pressures. But more importantly, the contract would establish Patrick's reputation as a skilled horsebreaker, potentially leading to additional work from other ranchers in the area. As the crowd dispersed and the business negotiations concluded, Jake felt a sense of cautious optimism about their prospects. The demonstration had proven that his faith in Patrick's abilities was justified, and the contract work would provide a sustainable source of income that didn't depend entirely on the volatile cattle market. But the success also highlighted the precarious nature of their situation. Their financial stability was now partially dependent on a 16-year-old boy's ability to consistently perform dangerous work without injury. One serious accident could destroy not just Patrick's career prospects, but the entire family's security. That evening, as the household celebrated Patrick's success with a special dinner featuring Maggie's attempt at a cake made from their limited supplies, Jake found himself reflecting on how much their lives had changed in just a few weeks. The desperate family that had stood on Walter Grimsby's auction platform was transforming into something new, not just survivors, but contributors to the community's economic and social fabric. Timothy had been quiet during the celebration, and Jake noticed the 12-year-old slipping away from the festivities to sit alone on the front steps. Following his instincts, Jake joined the boy outside, recognizing something of his own adolescent struggles in Timothy's withdrawal. "Big day for your brother," Jake observed, settling beside the quiet boy. Timothy nodded, but didn't speak immediately. When he finally did, his voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for his 12 years. "Patrick's always been the special one," Timothy said quietly. "Even when Pa was alive, everyone could see that Patrick had something different about him. Now he's got this skill with horses, and people are taking notice. What if I never find anything I'm special at?" Jake remembered feeling the same way about his own older brother, who'd seemed to excel at everything while Jake struggled to find his place in the world. It was a universal experience among younger siblings, but knowing that didn't make Timothy's feelings any less real or painful. "You know what I see when I watch you work with the cattle?" Jake asked. "I see someone who notices things other people miss. You spotted that sick heifer 3 days before Carlos or I would have caught it. You know when the herd's getting restless before they even know it themselves. That's not a small talent, Timothy. That's the kind of skill that keeps ranches profitable and animals healthy." Timothy looked up with surprise, clearly not having considered his cattle work as anything more than routine chores. "Really?" he asked, hope creeping into his voice. "Really?" Jake confirmed. "Patrick's got a gift with horses, but you've got a gift with cattle. Different skills, both valuable. The ranching business needs people who can read livestock the way you do." The conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Maggie, who'd been looking for Timothy to help with the evening chores. But instead of calling him inside, she sat down on the step beside her son and looked out at the darkening valley. "What are you two discussing so seriously?" she asked, her tone gentle. "Just talking about finding your place in the world," Jake replied. "About recognizing the talents you have instead of worrying about the ones you don't." Maggie nodded, knowingly. "That's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. All of us finding new places, new roles, new ways to contribute. It's not easy, starting over when you thought your life was settled." There was something in her tone that suggested she was talking about more than just her children's adjustment to ranch life. Jake realized that Maggie herself was struggling with questions of identity and purpose, trying to figure out who she was supposed to be in this new context. Before marriage and motherhood, she'd been a school teacher, educated and independent. After marriage, she'd been a farmer's wife, supporting her husband's dreams while raising their children. Now she was. What? A widow dependent on charity? A housekeeper earning her keep through domestic labor? Something else entirely? "What kind of place are you looking for?" Jake asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Maggie was quiet, for a moment considering the question carefully. "I want to be useful," she said finally. "Not just grateful, not just getting by, but actually contributing something meaningful. I have skills and knowledge that are going to waste if all I'm doing is cooking and cleaning." It was a fair point, and one that Jake hadn't fully considered. In his focus on finding roles for the children and ensuring their basic survival, he'd perhaps underestimated Maggie's own need for purposeful work that utilized her education and abilities. "What kind of contribution did you have in mind?" he asked. Maggie's answer surprised him. "I'd like to start a proper school, not just teaching my own children in the front parlor, but establishing a real educational program for all the children. In this part of the valley, there are at least 15 families within reasonable distance who have school-aged children getting no formal education at all." It was an ambitious idea, one that would require significant planning and resources. But it was also exactly the kind of forward-thinking project that could transform their temporary arrangement into something permanent and valuable to the entire community. "Where would you hold classes?" Jake asked, already beginning to consider the practical implications. "The old barn," Maggie replied without hesitation. "It's weatherproof and spacious, and with some basic modifications, it could accommodate 20 or 30 students. We'd need desks, books, supplies, but it's possible." Jake found himself caught up in her enthusiasm. A school would not only provide education for the valley's children, but would also establish Maggie as a respected community member rather than just a charity case. It would give her independence and purpose while serving a genuine need. But it would also require investment and planning at a time when their resources were already stretched thin. The question was whether they could afford to take on such an ambitious project or whether they could afford not to. As if reading his thoughts, Timothy spoke up with surprising maturity. "If Ma started a school, people would pay for their children to attend, wouldn't they? That could help with money problems too." It was an astute observation from the 12-year-old, and one that added a practical dimension to Maggie's idealistic vision. A successful school could indeed provide income while serving the community's needs. "It's worth exploring," Jake said finally. "Let me think about the logistics and see what might be possible." As they sat together on the porch steps, watching the first stars appear in the clear mountain sky, Jake realized that something fundamental had shifted in their arrangement. What had begun as emergency charity was evolving into genuine partnership, with each member of their expanded family finding ways to contribute their unique skills and abilities to their collective success. The challenges ahead remained daunting: financial pressures, the approaching winter, the complex dynamics of 10 people learning to live together as a family. But they also had something valuable to build on: a shared commitment to making their unusual situation work, and the growing recognition that their combined talents might be greater than the sum of their individual struggles. Tomorrow would bring new tests of their resolve and resourcefulness, but tonight it was enough to know that they were all committed to building something lasting together. The desperate family that had stood on Walter Grimsby's auction platform was becoming something new, not just survivors, but creators of their own future. Winter arrived in Cedar Creek Valley with the sudden ferocity of a wild animal, transforming the landscape overnight from autumn gold to pristine white. The first blizzard caught everyone slightly unprepared, dumping 18 inches of snow in a single night and sealing the Sullivan Ranch off from the outside world for nearly a week. But instead of creating the hardship Jake had feared, the enforced isolation became an unexpected blessing that allowed their makeshift family to truly bond and establish the rhythms that would carry them through the difficult months ahead. The additional rooms Jake had been frantically trying to complete before the snow fell were finished just in time, thanks to Patrick's tireless work and Ben Cooper's expertise. The new construction provided proper bedrooms for the boys and a larger kitchen that could accommodate their expanded household without everyone stepping on each other's toes. More importantly, it gave each member of the family a sense of permanence, a physical confirmation that this arrangement was meant to last beyond mere emergency shelter. Maggie's school project had evolved from ambitious dream to practical reality with surprising speed once word spread through the valley. Parents who had been resigned to their children receiving no formal education suddenly found themselves with an opportunity they had never expected. By the time the snow began to fall, Maggie had commitments from 12 families to send their children to classes in the renovated barn, with tuition payments that would provide steady income throughout the winter months. The transformation of the old barn into a schoolhouse had become a community effort that surprised everyone involved. Neighboring ranchers contributed lumber, labor, and supplies without being asked, seemingly eager to be part of a project that would benefit all their children. Even Walter Grimsby, perhaps sensing the political wisdom of supporting education, had donated a set of mathematics textbooks that his bank had acquired when the previous schoolmaster left the territory. But it was the response of the children themselves that truly validated Maggie's vision. On the first day of classes, 16 youngsters ranging in age from 6 to 15 gathered in the warm, well-lit barn classroom with an eagerness that spoke to their hunger for learning. Some could barely read, others had never held a pencil properly, but all of them understood that they were being offered something precious and rare. Katie O'Brien had naturally become Maggie's assistant teacher, helping the younger students with basic reading while Maggie worked with the older children on more advanced subjects. The 14-year-old showed remarkable patience and skill in explaining difficult concepts, often finding ways to make lessons clearer than Maggie's more formal teaching methods could achieve. "She has a real gift for this," Maggie confided to Jake one evening as they reviewed the day's lessons. "Better than I was at her age, certainly. I think Katie could become a teacher herself if she wanted to pursue it." The winter months also provided Patrick with steady work, breaking horses for various ranchers throughout the valley. Word of his success with Jake Morrison's gelding had spread quickly, and by December he had more requests for his services than he could reasonably handle. The income from his horse-breaking work, combined with Maggie's teaching fees, had transformed the ranch's financial situation from desperate to stable. But more than the money, Patrick's growing reputation as a skilled horseman had given him something even more valuable: self-respect and a sense of his own worth that went beyond gratitude for being rescued. When neighboring ranchers spoke of the O'Brien boy now, it was with the kind of respect reserved for genuine skill, not the patronizing sympathy often shown to charity cases. Timothy had found his own niche working with the cattle, developing an almost supernatural ability to predict and prevent problems before they became serious. His quiet observation skills had saved the ranch money repeatedly throughout the winter, catching everything from early signs of disease to potential fence breaks that could have led to lost livestock. "That boy's got the eye," Carlos observed, with genuine admiration. "You can't teach what he's got. Some people are born knowing how to read animals, and Timothy's one of them." Even the younger children had found meaningful ways to contribute to their household's success. Sean's meticulous record-keeping of egg production had revealed patterns that allowed them to optimize the hen's diet and increase overall output. Mickey's friendship with the barn cats had resulted in the most effective rodent control program the ranch had ever implemented. Little Mary's gentle nature with the dairy cows had somehow increased milk production, though no one could quite explain why the animals seemed to give more milk when she was present during milking. Baby Daniel, now walking steadily and beginning to form recognizable words, had become the household's unofficial mascot, charming visitors and providing comic relief during tense moments. His presence seemed to soften even the most hardened ranchers who came to do business with Jake, reminding everyone that their unusual family arrangement was ultimately about protecting and nurturing the most vulnerable among them. The true test of their stability came in February, when a particularly severe blizzard struck the valley, isolating individual ranches for weeks and testing everyone's preparations and resolve. The Sullivan Ranch weathered the storm better than most, thanks partly to their careful planning, but mostly to the simple fact that they had more hands available to handle the increased workload that severe weather demanded. When other ranchers struggled to keep paths clear to their barns and animals fed despite the deep snow, the Sullivan Ranch operated with smooth efficiency. Patrick and Timothy could maintain the livestock feeding schedule even when Jake and the hired hands were occupied with more specialized tasks. Katie and Bridget helped Maggie keep the younger children occupied and educated despite being confined, indoors for days at a time. Sean and Mickey found ways to contribute that kept them busy and useful rather than restless and troublesome. But it was during this storm that their family faced its most serious challenge yet. Tommy Wright, who had become something like a big brother to Patrick and Timothy, was severely injured when a snow-laden tree branch crashed down on him while he was clearing paths to the barn. The injury to his back was serious enough that Docky, Emma Harrison, couldn't be certain he would walk again, let alone continue the physically demanding work of ranch life. The accident forced everyone to confront the harsh realities of their situation in ways they had managed to avoid until then. Tommy's injury could have easily happened to any of them, and the financial implications of supporting someone who couldn't work were sobering. Moreover, Tommy's despair at potentially being permanently disabled created an emotional crisis that affected everyone in the household. It was Maggie who found the solution, approaching the problem with the same practical wisdom she brought to teaching. During Tommy's long convalescence, she began working with him on learning to read and write properly, skills he had never fully developed during his hard Scrabble upbringing. What began as simple distraction to keep his mind occupied gradually evolved into serious education that opened new possibilities for his future. "Even if your back doesn't heal completely," Maggie told him during one of their lessons, "there are other kinds of work that use your mind instead of your muscles. Bookkeeping, correspondence, planning, and organizing, skills that are valuable on any ranch." The suggestion that he might transition from physical ranch work to more administrative responsibilities gave Tommy hope during his darkest moments. More importantly, it demonstrated to everyone in the household that their commitment to each other extended beyond simple economic utility. They were truly becoming a family in the deepest sense, bound together by loyalty and affection rather than mere convenience. Spring arrived with the dramatic suddenness typical of Montana, transforming the snow-covered landscape into a riot of green grass and wildflowers almost overnight. The change in weather brought visitors to the Sullivan Ranch, neighbors and business associates who had heard various versions of the story throughout the winter and were curious to see how the unusual arrangement was working out. Most visitors left impressed by what they observed. The ranch was clearly prospering, the children were healthy and well-educated, and the overall atmosphere was one of purposeful industry rather than chaotic improvisation. Maggie's school had gained a reputation throughout the territory for excellence, with some families traveling considerable distances to enroll their children. Patrick's horse-breaking skills were in such demand that he was booked months in advance, commanding premium prices for his gentle but effective methods. But it was the family dynamics that most impressed observant visitors. Despite the wide range of ages and the circumstances that had brought them together, the O'Brien children and the Sullivan Ranch hands functioned as a cohesive unit with genuine affection for each other. Mealtimes were lively affairs filled with conversation and laughter. Work was shared without complaint or coercion. Conflicts, when they arose, were resolved through discussion rather than authority. "I've never seen anything quite like it," admitted Reverend Walsh during one of his visits. 10 people who aren't blood relatives, living together in harmony and mutual support. It's almost like those early Christian communities described in Scripture. The comparison wasn't entirely fanciful. Their household had indeed developed something resembling the communal values that religious communities aspired to achieve: shared resources, mutual aid, individual contribution according to ability, and collective decision-making on important matters. But it was grounded in practical necessity rather than theological principle, which perhaps made it more sustainable than arrangements based purely on idealism. The ultimate validation of their success came in an unexpected form that spring. Jake Morrison, whose horse-breaking contract had provided Patrick's first major opportunity, approached Jake with a proposal that went far beyond simple business dealings. "I've been watching what you've built here," Morrison said during a visit that stretched from afternoon into evening. "Not just the financial success, though that's impressive enough. I'm talking about the human success, the way you've created something stable and productive out of what could have been a disaster." Morrison's own ranch was substantial, encompassing several thousand acres and employing dozens of workers during peak seasons. But his children were grown and scattered. His wife had passed away the previous year, and he was facing the prospect of managing his vast operation alone as he entered his 60s. "I'd like to propose a partnership," Morrison continued. "Merge our operations, combine our resources, create something bigger and more sustainable than either of us could manage alone. Your family would move to my ranch, which has much more space and better facilities. In return, I'd get partners I can trust and workers whose loyalty isn't just about wages." It was an extraordinary offer, one that would solve virtually all of their remaining financial concerns while providing opportunities for growth that the Sullivan Ranch alone could never offer. Morrison's property included better grazing land, more modern facilities, and proximity to transportation that would make their various enterprises more profitable. But the proposal also required them to abandon the place where they had built their new life together, to trust their hard-won stability to someone else's vision and management style. It was the kind of decision that could only be made collectively, after careful consideration of everyone's needs and concerns. The family meeting that followed Morrison's proposal lasted well into the night, with everyone from 16-year-old Patrick down to 8-year-old Bridget having their say about the decision. The discussion revealed how much their relationships had matured over the months they had been together. Instead of Jake making an executive decision, or Maggie speaking for all her children, each person was encouraged to express their own thoughts and concerns. Patrick was initially resistant to the idea, worried that leaving the ranch, where he had first proven himself, might somehow diminish his accomplishments. But when Morrison assured him that the partnership would include expanded opportunities for his horse-breaking business, including the possibility of establishing a formal training program for other young horsemen, his resistance melted into enthusiasm. Timothy was concerned about leaving the cattle herd he had learned to understand so well, but Morrison's much larger herd offered opportunities for him to develop his skills on a scale that the Sullivan Ranch could never provide. Katie worried about the continuity of her teaching responsibilities, but Morrison's ranch was actually closer to several communities that would provide more students for her mother's school. Even the youngest children found aspects of the proposed move that excited them. Morrison's ranch had a swimming creek, established gardens, and a workshop where Mickey could learn carpentry skills to complement his vivid imagination. Little Mary was particularly excited about the prospect of more barn cats to befriend, but it was Maggie who articulated the deeper significance of Morrison's proposal. "He's not asking us to work for him," she observed. He's asking us to work with him. That's a very different thing, and it's exactly what we've been trying to build here. Genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. The decision, when it finally came, was unanimous. They would accept Morrison's offer, but with conditions that protected their autonomy and ensured that their family structure would remain intact. The legal documents that formalized their partnership were unlike anything the territorial lawyers had ever drafted, creating a business relationship that was also explicitly a family alliance. The move itself took place in late spring, with a caravan of wagons carrying their possessions, livestock, and dreams to their new home. The Sullivan Ranch was everything they had been promised and more. A sprawling operation with facilities that made their previous struggles seem almost quaint in retrospect. But more importantly, Morrison himself proved to be the kind of partner they had hoped for. He was genuinely interested in their ideas for expanding and improving the operation, respectful of their need to maintain their family bonds, and generous in sharing both the work and the profits of their combined enterprise. Tommy Wright, whose back had healed enough to allow limited physical work, became the ranch's new bookkeeper and general manager, his natural intelligence and newly acquired literacy making him invaluable in handling the complex business affairs of the expanded operation. Carlos was promoted to head foreman, overseeing a crew of hands that included several other experienced cowboys. Ben Cooper became the chief building and maintenance supervisor, finally able to implement some of the improvements he had been dreaming about for years. Maggie's school expanded dramatically in its new location with a purpose-built schoolhouse that could accommodate 40 students and boarding facilities for children whose families lived too far away for daily travel. Her reputation as an educator had spread beyond the immediate area, attracting families from across the territory who were willing to pay premium tuition for quality education. Patrick's horse-breaking business evolved into something approaching a formal academy, with Morrison providing both the facilities and the financial backing for Patrick to begin training other young men in his methods. The combination of Patrick's natural ability and Maggie's teaching skills created a unique program that produced skilled horsemen who were sought after throughout the region. But perhaps the most significant change was in the family dynamics themselves. The move to Morrison's ranch had required them to adapt to new circumstances while maintaining their essential bonds, and the successful transition proved that their relationships were strong enough to survive major changes. They were no longer held together by mere necessity or gratitude, but by genuine affection and shared commitment to each other's success. The first anniversary of their rescue from Walter Grimsby's auction platform was marked not with somber reflection on past hardships, but with a celebration that filled Morrison's ranch house with laughter and music. Neighbors and friends gathered to acknowledge not just their survival, but their transformation into one of the most successful and respected families in the territory. Jake found himself standing on the porch of his new home, watching the celebration and marveling at the journey that had brought them all to this point. A year ago, he had been a lonely widower, facing financial ruin, making an impulsive decision that everyone told him would destroy him. Tonight, he was surrounded by family and friends, his financial concerns replaced by discussions of expansion and investment. His empty house transformed into a center of activity and joy. Maggie joined him on the porch. Baby Daniel balanced on her hip while the older children continued their celebration inside. At nearly 2 years old, Daniel was walking confidently and speaking in simple sentences, showing no signs of the frailty that had worried everyone during his first months. At the ranch, any regrets? Maggie asked, settling into the chair beside him. Jake considered the question seriously. The past year had been challenging in ways he couldn't have imagined, filled with financial stress, logistical complications, and the complex Dynamics of building relationships among people thrown together by circumstances, but it had also been the most meaningful period of his life since Sarah's death, restoring his sense of purpose and filling his days with the kind of profound satisfaction that came from knowing his work mattered to people he cared about. "None," he said finally. "Not one." From inside the house came the sound of Patrick playing fiddle, while Katie sang a song their father had taught them years ago. Timothy and Sean were engaged in animated conversation with Morrison about plans for expanding the cattle operation, while Mickey and Mary showed off their latest treasures to anyone willing to pay attention. Tommy Wright sat near the fireplace, helping Bridget with a reading lesson despite the festive atmosphere around them. It was a scene of domestic contentment that would have been impossible to imagine a year ago, when 9 desperate people had stood on an auction platform facing an uncertain future. But it was also something more, a demonstration that families could be created through choice and commitment as surely as through blood and birth, that love and loyalty could triumph over economic hardship and social prejudice. The celebration continued well into the night, with stories and songs that wove their shared experiences into the kind of family mythology that would be passed down to future generations. There were tales of the first winter's challenges, of Patrick's breakthrough with the stubborn gelding, of Tommy's accident and recovery, of Maggie's first day teaching in the converted barn. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of their shared identity. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Jake found himself surrounded by the people who had become his family through the simple act of opening his door to those in need. They were planning the next day's work, discussing dreams for the future, negotiating the small conflicts and accommodations that were part of any family's daily life. Walter Grimsby had been wrong about almost everything, but he had been right about one thing. Jake's impulsive decision to rescue the O'Brien family had indeed changed his life forever. But instead of destroying him financially and emotionally, it had given him a richness of purpose and relationship that no amount of money could have purchased. Looking around at the faces illuminated by lamplight and firelight, Jake realized that he had accidentally discovered something that people spent entire lifetimes searching for: a sense of belonging, of being needed and valued, of contributing to something larger than himself. The struggling cowboy who had walked into Cedar Creek that October morning had found not just a family to save, but a family that would save him in return. The story that had begun with an auction block and a desperate act of charity had become something entirely different, a testament to the power of human connection to transform individual lives and create lasting bonds that transcended the circumstances of their origin. 9 people who had faced separation and bondage had become the foundation of a family and a business empire that would endure for generations. As the last lamp was extinguished and the house settled into peaceful silence, Jake Sullivan lay in his bed, surrounded by the gentle sounds of his sleeping family, and reflected on the mysterious ways that fate could disguise its greatest gifts as its heaviest burdens. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight it was enough to know that they would face them together, as they had faced everything else since that day when a struggling cowboy decided that some things were more important than money or safety or common sense. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.